Hey guys, plants and herbs and spices part 2. Sorry, I accidentally stopped the video. Let's continue. What were we saying? We were saying that as these aromatic compounds leave your herb or spice, the actual herb or spice that's left there has less flavor in it than when you started. So when you have things that are very have a lot of smell coming out, be aware. You want to add those later in the cooking process, because let's say you have some really nice, I keep going back to it, but it's one of the best examples of this, some really nice cardamom, and you want that flavor in there. Well, if you add it at the beginning, by the end of cooking, all that heat is going to drive out all those aromatic compounds, and you're going to be left with no cardamom taste, no terpenes to play around with your food. Maybe a little bit, but you really want to avoid these highly volatile, specifically terpenes, adding them early in the dish. Now, our other classification of aromatic compounds would be the phenolics. And phenolics, they're defined by a 6-carbon ring that has a little oxygen-hydrogen group. It's kind of like a water, just kind of stuck on there somewhere. And again, these come in hundreds of varieties. There are so many spices, and these have a much larger range in flavors. So they're what give cinnamon its distinctive flavor, as well as allspice. But even things like thyme and oregano also get their flavors from phenolics. Now, when it comes to phenolics, right, these are much less volatile, but they still are. Their key thing, though, is they have that little extra water group. And what that does is it allows them to dissolve in water a lot better than the terpenes, okay? If you take a terpene and you put it in water, it's just going to kind of float on the top and escape into the air. Whereas if you've ever taken like cinnamon and steeped it in, say, milk, it really well diffuses that flavor into it. So if you're wondering, hey, would this work well as something I can dissolve in water, your best bet is things that are based on phenolics. And there's a whole list in your book. You can check it out. Now, the other key thing to remember when we're talking about these herbs and spices is that these flavor compounds, or I guess there's two key things here. First is that no herb or spice is defined by a single flavor compound. All of these are combinations of lots of different flavor compounds, sometimes hundreds or thousands of these flavor compounds in this single herb or spice. And what's a really interesting little practice to do that I personally love, maybe I'm just weird like that, but if you taste these things, a lot of times you can taste the individual flavors that are going on in there, and that can give you some hint as to whether you've got terpenes or phenolics, right? Terpenes, again, being the pine and citrus, and phenolics pretty much being everything else. Again, check your book. They got really good list in there. So, but all of these flavor compounds have something in common, and that is that they are loosely based on oils. So their molecular structure is a lot more like an oil than it is water or alcohol. And if you remember back to when we were talking about oils and fats, right? Oils and fats are just lots of carbons. And both phenols or phenolics and terpenes are as well. And so what this means is that if you are trying to get the flavor out of these, the flavor is going to come out in two ways. First, aromatically. That is to say, if you add an herb or a spice on top of your food, you're going to be able to smell it and consequently taste it when you eat it. The other way is it's going to come out when you use oil or fat. Okay, this is why a lot of people toast certain herbs or spices before they actually go to use them. My favorite toasting spice is fennel. I usually do this with a little bit of butter and brown it up beforehand. And that butter not only browns this, which adds even more flavors to it, but it can actually serve to dissolve some of those flavor compounds that were present before. So, we've talked about like herbs and spices. What is in them? What gives them the flavor, right? Well, what about actually using them in the kitchen? Well, a couple things to remember, okay? Is we have to consider what herbs and spices are, okay? Because most times when you're using them in the kitchen, spices especially, they are always dried. And when they're dried, they are usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15% flavor compounds, or what we call essential oils. Now, essential oil, don't get freaked out as a new term. It's just a reference to the flavor compounds that are inside any herb or spice. Essential oils, because they act like oils, right? So when you're talking about keeping your spices around for a while, the great thing about them is that they're dried, but even dried, they have mostly oil. What that means is they're not very hospitable to, say, bacteria that are going to live on them. So spices keep for a really long time. Also, because they have these kind of little oil kind of globules that their flavors exist in, the flavor compounds aren't as likely to just kind of go off into the air, right? For example, consider my personal all-time favorite spice, this guy right here. If you don't recognize him, this guy is nutmeg. Absolute favorite. Never leave home without it. If you've never seen a nutmeg before, it looks kind of like a nut, like a pecan or a walnut, but you can't actually crack it. You just grate the inside and you get this, there's this really nice cool pattern on the inside, kind of stripy, but you can pick these up pretty much anywhere, any mega mart. My personal favorite is little kind of Middle Eastern markets. They usually have these for like 10 for $1, and they're super good to just grate over pretty much anything from hot cocoa to your favorite steak. Anyway, when I am storing these, the key thing is that we have to remember what causes aromatics to be released, and that is heat and that is oxygen. So if you keep these in a dry, cool place where there's no light, because remember, light basically is heat waiting to happen, okay? So if you are hitting this thing with light, it's going to heat up some of those molecules and release them aromatically, and that means less flavor inside here, so when you go to grate this thing, there's going to be nothing left. So cool, dry, dark place, these things will keep for a long time, okay? And that goes with most spices. Now, herbs, on the other hand, are a lot trickier. And the reason they're a lot trickier is they come from the leaves, and leaves are generally consist of a lot of water by weight. And if we want to dry something, we have to extract the water. That's what drying means, right? And so when you go to dry an herb, the problem is when the water is coming out, it has a tendency to pull out the aromatic compounds with it. Okay, so a good, well-dried herb is maybe 1% essential oil at that point. Now, me personally, I don't really go for dried herbs. You know, everybody's mom has this little Kroger can of rosemary or thyme or oregano. Go to the kitchen, open it up, take a whiff, and I bet you're not going to smell anything. If anything, it's going to smell kind of woody and old and stale, because this has probably been there since, I don't know, the dawn of time. And if you add this to your food, you're adding nothing to it other than an extra little bit of fiber, maybe. The reason is when you dry out herbs, you drastically reduce the amount of essential oils that are in them. Like we said, they evaporate away with the water, okay? And that means that even the best dried herbs that still have 1% essential oil, those are going to dissipate really fast. They're going to evaporate out of those herbs because not only have they been dried, but traditionally then they're crushed or ground up. And the more they're crushed and ground up, guess what? The more air is going to get at them and the more of them are going to be released. Okay, so when I'm talking herbs, I recommend pretty much strictly fresh herbs. You're going to get way more flavor power out of those because all of the aromatics are still inside. Okay, now let's say you do want to dry out some herbs, and there are good reasons to. I recommend doing it yourself. Usually letting them air dry in shade is the best because it's a gentle drying. So while the water will evaporate naturally, you're not heating up the leaf any, and so you're not releasing extra aromatic compounds, right? Again, with the shade, you don't want light hitting it either. Now, the one exception to this is if you want to dry a very small amount really quickly, the microwave actually works super good. But wait, doesn't the microwave add heat? Yes-ish. So the way that microwaves work is they produce a very specific frequency of wave that's targeted directly to water. So what you're doing is you're heating up and you're evaporating the water, but because you're using such a small amount of leaves, and the leaves are so thin, that water is going to evaporate before it can heat up those things around it. So if you're looking to dry out, a few leaves of basil, or maybe a sprig of rosemary or two, the microwave works really well. Now, once these are dried out, or if you're going to just keep fresh herbs, right? You picked them or you got them at the grocery store. How do you store them? Now, the key thing to remember here is that you've damaged them. You've started their ripening cycle, like we talked about with fruits, right? These things are ripening as you go. And so what you need is you need to keep it in an open container. Don't ever seal them because you'll seal it in with the ripening compounds it's producing and it will very quickly degrade. Now, so you want to keep it open, but you also want to keep the water out. So if you put it in like a plastic bag, wrap a paper towel around it, just very loosely, that'll keep your herbs pretty well. Now that said, there is no substitute for fresh herbs right out of a garden. And of all the garden things to make, an herb garden is one of the easiest to take care of. Strongly recommend it. But that's just me. Okay, so moving on. We've got our herbs, we've got our spices, we've got them stored properly, we know what's going on with them. So how about extracting that flavor when we're cooking, right? Well, the first and foremost thing you probably think of with herbs and spices is we've got to grind it up. And there are lots of ways to grind it up. My personal favorite is this guy, the mortar and pestle. I like this so much for a few reasons. One, when you grind things up in here, it doesn't add a whole lot of air. A lot of other processes you might use, like a food processor or coffee grinder, can incorporate a lot of air as those blades spin around really fast, and that can really release a lot of aromatic compounds. Now, the downside to these is that when you're grinding, you naturally will cause this to heat up a little bit, and that will cause the release of some heat. But one of the best things I love about this mortar and pestle is that as you work with it more and more, you're actually going to get some of those flavor compounds kind of seeping into the stone, and it's going to add really nice flavor to pretty much anything that you grind up in here. Now, like I said, some other possibilities, right, is food processor or coffee grinder. Coffee grinder is probably my second favorite compared to the good old Morty here, mainly because of its ease of use. And you can make kind of single serving quantities in there. One of the big problems with a food processor is you have to put a bunch in there to get it to work effectively, but chances are you're never going to use enough all that spice, and that's just a waste, right? So backtracking a little bit, just want to make sure I say this, is it's always best, especially with your spices, get your spices whole, right? I've got my allspice here, and you can hear it. It's whole allspice, right? That's how I get all my spices, is whole, and then I'll grind them myself. Because if you get them powdered, you immediately are releasing those aromatic compounds, and that's what we need for flavor. Okay, so back to using these flavors. So you can grind them, mortar and pestle, coffee grinder. When it comes to herbs, right, a lot, you can chop them up, and that's fine. That's a really good way to, right before you use them, kind of release the aromatic compounds, right? Because we've talked about keeping them in there, but when you're cooking, you want to release them. You want to be able to taste and smell them. And so chopping them up right before, great way to do that. Okay, now one of the other really popular ways to do this is to infuse these flavor compounds into another medium, like an oil or alcohol. Things to keep in mind, though, is that when it comes to oils, oils are great at pulling out these flavor compounds because they are essentially oils. So oils are great at dissolving other oils. But at the end of the day, they're going to also not release them as well as other mediums because they like each other, so it's going to be harder to get them to separate. That's why those nice gourmet infused olive oils, not my bag, because even though, yes, I will agree, there's a lot of flavor in there, actually getting it out of there doesn't happen as easily. Now, the other thing you can do is dissolving something in alcohol. A lot of times if you, say, deglaze a pan with like red wine, you can free up and dissolve a lot more of those flavor compounds than you could with just plain water. Now, the thing about alcohol, while it's not going to pull as many of those flavors, it does do a better job at dissolving them than water does. And the great thing about alcohol is it boils really at a really low temperature, and so you're going to get a release of a lot more of those aromas. That's why deglazing with alcohol is always my preferred method to go if you have access to a nice cooking wine. Now, other ways of extracting flavor. Steaming and smoking is wonderful for extracting flavor. And the reason goes back to what the flavor is. Remember, flavor is aromatic molecules. So these things like to be in the air. Now, if you put them on something to steam or smoke, that heat is going to cause those aromatic molecules to release. And the steam that's actually cooking your food, or the smoke that is traveling to it through the air. So it's going to pick up a lot of those flavor molecules and just stuff them onto your food. And that is certainly delicious. So steaming and smoking is a great place for you to use your herbs and spices. Okay. Other ways, this one's a little controversial, right? If you have anyone in your family that's a big barbecue head, right, they will swear by a marinade or a rub. Now, here's the thing about marinades. A lot of people say, oh yeah, that marinade, it really gets in there and makes it taste like whatever, oranges or apples or candy, I don't know. But here's the thing about marinades. Yes, they will probably impart some flavor, right? You can't soak something in a really flavorful liquid for very long without it getting something in there. But the idea that that flavor is penetrating to the darkest depths of the steak is totally unreasonable. The meat is such a thick, dense thing that for it to penetrate all the way would require very active movement of these molecules that it just doesn't have. So while marinades are good, I personally prefer rubs. And the reason is you're applying these herbs and spices directly to the outside of the meat. And what's going to happen is as those cook, they are going to crust up and essentially seal in some of those aromatic compounds before they're released. That way, when you take a bite of it, you're releasing them from this kind of crusted underbelly of the rub, and you really get that flavor. Whereas with marinades, you're maybe getting some of them infusing in, and even then, you have to bite it and chew it to release that flavor. Okay? So I prefer rubs over marinades every day of the week. Now, a couple final applications though. Herbs especially are wonderful for coating food. For example, taking basil leaves or thyme and wrapping a salmon in it. One of the reasons for this is what you're doing by doing that is you're essentially removing the direct heat from that salmon. So now all the direct heat is going into those herbs or spices and causing them to release their aromatics directly at the food. So you get two benefits. One, you get a lot of aromatic compounds going straight into that food. But two, you avoid that direct heat, which can lead to overcooking of something. A lot of that direct heat gets deflected by the herbs, and so you can get a really nice, evenly cooked piece of food. Now, the final thing that herbs and spices get used a lot in is extracts. And this is just a kind of bonus thing I wanted to touch on. So the idea behind an extract is that you take if you're making an extract in the home, right, is you're taking some herb or spice and putting it in alcohol, usually like a vodka, and just letting it sit there until all of the flavor has seeped into the liquid. And this is great because it essentially super concentrates that flavor into one spot, okay? And so extracts can be really powerful flavor, and if you keep them sealed, they won't release these aromatic compounds, which is awesome. Now, extracts that you buy in the store are made much the same way, but if you've ever seen imitation extracts, those are actually made in a lab without the use of any herbs or spices. Now, that might sound like a really bad thing initially, but scientists have actually gotten really good at replicating the exact molecules that we desire when we talk about, say, vanilla or peppermint. And they just dissolve those in water, basically. And what can be really good about those is they're usually a lot cheaper. So while I personally prefer a good homemade extract, that's just not for everybody. Please don't feel like you need the best extract in order to cook successfully. Imitation extracts, or synthetic extracts, as they're sometimes called, are sometimes just as good or pretty good when it comes to unleashing the flavor potential of your dish. So I hope we enlightened you on herbs and spices, and stick around for the bonus round where you'll see your lab. With that, bye!